Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us at this lunch talk on voting rights and overcoming voter suppression. ACLU and ACS are so excited to host such a distinguished guest to speak on these issues. Valerie Jarrett is a senior distinguished fellow at the law school. She currently serves as board chair of When We All Vote, a nonpartisan organization that aims to increase voter participation. She also serves on the boards of various corporations and nonprofits. Ms. Jarrett was the longest serving senior advisor to President Obama. She oversaw the offices of public engagement and intergovernmental affairs and worked throughout her tenure at the White House to mobilize elected officials, militant community leaders, and diverse groups of advocates. Before that, Ms. Jarrett worked in both the public and private sectors in a range of legal, business, and governmental roles. Ms. Jarrett has also received numerous awards and honorary degrees, including Time's 100 Most Influential People, as well as the Abner J. Mikva Legal Legends Award. Ms. Jarrett received her BA from Stanford University and her JD from the University of Michigan Law School. Thanks for being with us today, Ms. Jarrett. We'll hear from Ms. Jarrett for the majority of this lunch talk and leave some time at the end for Q&A. Feel free to leave your questions in the chat or to raise your blue hand and ask questions at that time. And with that, I'll hand it off to Ariel.
Thank you for that introduction.
Thank you, Katya. Hi, Ms. Jarrett. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're all really excited to hear from you.
My pleasure. Good to see you all too. I assume those I can't see are busy eating lunch, but I'm glad to know you're there.
It's really awkward to eat lunch in front of a camera, so most people tend to keep it off. All right, so to start off the event, I think it's appropriate to kind of get a broad view about what the current issues with voting are today. So with that in mind, what in your mind are the largest barriers to voting today?
Well, perhaps the biggest barrier is we have to get out of our own way, and that's those who disenfranchise themselves. In the last presidential election, 100 million eligible voters did not vote. In a democracy, that's just not acceptable. Now, it's fair to say that a number of people, particularly in southern states, experience their votes being suppressed, and that's usually directed at young people and people of color. But there are certainly efforts underway right now to push back on that. This year, in the midst of the COVID-19, we have seen increased activism of late, which I think is a good sign. And we are seeing record numbers of people turn out in the early vote, in large part because of that activism, but also because people realize, looking at the long lines, that it's better to get out there early than to wait until the last minute. And we are breaking through all kinds of records on that. But a barrier is the fact that some people are waiting up to 12 hours. I mean, my own mom, who was worried about voting by mail because of all of the concerns about the Postal Service being able to accommodate this large influx in ballots that are mailed in, decided last Saturday she was going to go down and vote in person. She lives in Hyde Park, and she went to the local polling place and waited for a half an hour, and that's when they moved her up because she was a senior citizen. At age 91, you shouldn't have to stand for a half an hour, let alone everybody else that's standing for as long as 12 and 14 hours. So that's a barrier too. Now, I hope that if you get there and there's a long line, it makes you angry and more determined than ever to stay. And maybe for students that's possible, but for a lot of people whose employers are not giving them the time off to vote, it's a big problem, which is one of the reasons I've been challenging employers around the country to not just give people 2 hours, but give them as long as it takes to vote. You shouldn't have to be thinking, I'm going to get docked when I'm trying to exercise this most fundamental responsibility. So I think the first thing is, let's not disenfranchise ourselves. Second is, let's put the spotlight when secretaries of state are dropping the ball and not being able to handle this influx of people showing up in person. And we should be recognizing we can vote them out of office as well. And let's continue to support, as the ACLU has done, many of these lawsuits in parts of the country that are violating the law, although some of the teeth that we had in the Voting Rights Act were taken away by the Supreme Court a few years ago, and a really landmark case that stripped the protections of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act out. But that doesn't mean that there aren't clear violations of the law. And so hats off to the ACLU for being one of the active participants in these lawsuits to get rid of these discriminatory, suppressive practices. I'll just give you one good example, which hopefully hits near and dear to your heart since you're students, and that is that in Texas, if you have a license to carry firearms, Well, you know what? That's just fine to get your voter registration. But if you have a student ID, not good enough. Well, it's obvious what the method and goal is there, and we have to push back on those kinds of onerous laws. And they've been working. Some of them have been working their way through the court system. We saw in Georgia 2 lawsuits during the last election when Stacey Abrams was running for governor that she brought against the Secretary of State who was running against her, overseeing the election and running for the office that she was running for governor. These strict IDs where you have to have your name exactly right, et cetera. And the final thing I would say on here that gets in that's a barrier is people not knowing their rights. And there are many examples of where secretaries of state are purging the rolls. So everybody needs to check to see if they're actually still registered. But if you show up and you're not on the rolls, you still can cast a provisional ballot. But most people don't know that. If they get there and their name isn't there, they're embarrassed and they try to get out of there as fast as they can. And we have to really go out of our way to help people understand what their rights are so that they can exercise that important opportunity to vote.
So I wanted to follow up with you on some of these suppressive tactics and ways to remedy them. First, I will say, though, that we definitely take your point about self-disenfranchisement, and I encourage everybody, if they're not already registered or haven't already voted early, to go check it out.
Thank you.
But when we're talking about voter suppression and remedies around that, what do you think are some of the more feasible ways for us to approach or to remedy voter suppression? Aside from lawsuits, what are your feelings on initiatives such as, automatic voter registration, or maybe having universal mail-in ballots, and the like?
Well, so first of all, in this era of advanced technology, when I can transfer large sums of money on my iPhone, when I can comply with the census forms and fill those out online, it's ridiculous that anybody has to leave their home in order to vote. We can figure this out in a way that's safe and fair and accessible for everybody. So I would go even further than saying, of course, everybody should be able to register online. Of course, everybody who gets a driver's license should automatically be enrolled and registered to vote. But we ought to be able to do better than that. We ought to be able to vote online. And, as I said, this is not rocket science. We figured out far more complicated technology than this. And I think part of what we need to do is to understand who's responsible for overseeing these elections. And then we've got to go right at them and put the spotlight on these practices that are suppressing the vote. And I will say that over the last 4 years, you're getting a lot more attention on these onerous practices, similarly to what we saw when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, where Black people were required to count the number of jelly beans in a jar, or there was a poll tax or a literacy tax. And when you put the spotlight on it and you see activism and then people vote, that's how change happens.
Thank you for that. Now to change tracks a little bit. So recently, Americans have been growing continually unconfident in the outcomes of our upcoming general election. There have been reports about the Californian Republican Party setting up, sham mail-in ballots. There's been the consistent commentary from the president on the issue of mail-in ballots and potential voter fraud. So how do we as a society kind of foster public confidence in our elections, particularly in a year like this, where everything is kind of going a bit haywire regardless?
To say the least, haywire is the understatement for where we are. Look, I'm deeply and profoundly troubled because the foundation of a democracy is the integrity of our election process. And well, let's start at the top. So President Trump is beginning to do actually what he did in the last election. When he thought he was way behind in the polls to Hillary Clinton, he started saber rattling about a rigged election. Nobody knew exactly what he meant back then, but it was intended to sow uncertainty about its integrity. This time, he's decided to zero in on absentee ballots. And look, the military have been voting absentee since the Civil War. There are states from Oregon to Wisconsin to Ohio that have this as a part of their DNA, where you don't have to have a special reason for why you're requesting an absentee ballot. Our home state, Illinois, same thing. I voted by absentee mail, but I did it early because I was worried about the next issue, which is the Postal Service. We have all seen that it is under-resourced. And in addition to being under-resourced, and there are examples in the primary where people didn't even receive their ballot, or it was sent in, but it didn't get in time. But we've also just seen examples of how they're pulling up mailboxes in certain communities, restricting the number of drop boxes to one for a huge territory. And as you mentioned, excuse me, the illegal practices that some in the Republican Party are in terms of either putting up fake boxes or removing real boxes. And so we have to be extraordinarily mindful of all of these practices, the ones that are actually fine, like you should be able to mail your ballot and it will get there okay, particularly if you do it ahead of time. And then we should be putting a spotlight on, well, why didn't we resource the Postal Service adequately? Why didn't we make sure that the secretaries of state around the country had enough people who were working on election day to be able to move those lines a little bit more expeditiously? So I do think that there are lots of steps that we can take short of litigation to put the spotlight on where the weaknesses are in our system. Having said all of that, and you didn't mention, but we surely should, that last night we heard from Homeland Security and the FBI evidence that countries such as Iran and Russia are definitely trying to interfere with our election. And the question I would say is, over the last 4 years since the last election, when all 16 of our intelligence agencies said that there was evidence that Russia was trying to interfere, why didn't we take the necessary steps in the intervening years to harden our system to protect it from intrusion? So where does this leave us? Everybody should vote. Everybody should make a plan, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, about what's the way you feel comfortable and safe voting. And you should say, well, where are the weaknesses? If we know a weakness is the Postal Service, do what I did, send in your ballot early. If we know there are going to be long lines, come be prepared to wait. Bring a folding chair, this picnic basket, some music, whatever makes you happy to pass the time of day. We have to plan given the environment that we're in. And is it more challenging? Yes. But do I ultimately believe that the election will be fair? I actually do. And I also think that we have to manage expectations because of all the factors we just mentioned, particularly these ballots coming in by mail. It is very likely that the election will not be concluded on election day. And the rhetoric around that is troubling too, because as long as it takes, we should give the various election agencies the time they need to count the ballots. And if that takes 1 day or 2 days or 5 days, whatever it takes, it should be allotted so that every vote that's cast is counted. And I'm worried, really quite sincerely worried, that if the election outcome isn't announced pretty quickly, that there will be people who take to the streets to demonstrate, and I worry about those demonstrations becoming violent.
I think we all do.
I wish I could be more optimistic, but I think we have to know what's to come so we prepare ourselves for it and actually call on each other and our leaders to say, turn down the temperature rather than behave in an incendiary way.
While we're on the topic of protests and demonstrations, this summer has seen like a huge increase in political activity on the street level following the wake of George Floyd's murder. So while we're on the topic, I wanted to know what your thoughts on protesting and demonstrating as effective tools of change alongside voting, or, you know, as you mentioned, potentially after the election's even cast, and kind of how does protests as a tool, you know, shape our society or help lead us to progress or detriment?
Well, I'm a very strong believer in our First Amendment right to freedom of speech. And I think that because it's embedded in our foundation, it's an indication of how seriously we take it as an underpinning, a foundation of our democracy. This summer, as you mentioned, we saw record protests in all 50 states, hearteningly, people of all ages, all races, backgrounds, coming together to say Black Lives Matter. And in the history of our country, change has only happened when ordinary people decided that they were going to feel empowered to participate in the change. This is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment that gave white women the right to vote. Well, how did that happen? It happened because women participated in hunger strikes and demonstrations, and they went to prison, and their husbands shunned them. And many of the women who began that effort back in 1866, when the petition for universal suffrage was signed and sent in, didn't even live to see the ultimate passage of the 19th Amendment, but the work that they did laid the foundation. I would say the same thing for the civil rights movement. Demonstrations, whether it was the boycott in Montgomery or the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, people put themselves in harm's way to bring to the attention the need for change. And then, of course, the LGBTQ community activism around rights, whether it was same-sex marriage or benefits or the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that were done really state by state by state, laid the foundation not only for each of those states to reverse their policies, but ultimately for the Supreme Court to reach the conclusion that it did in several cases affecting the rights of the LGBTQ community, and put pressure on Congress to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So, and I could go on. I mean, the incredible March for Our Lives that the young kids from Parkland organized after they had the mass shooting at their school, going from state to state to state, laying the foundation for the largest single day of marches that I think we've ever had in our history, organized by people who are younger than you guys. And it's usually the young people that drive this change. And so where does this leave us? It leaves us with this knowledge that there is an entrenchment in the status quo. And people who have power never give it up. People who have a vested interest in things staying as they are, they're not going to change unless we, the people, the beginning of our Constitution, decide we're going to force that change. I believe that those demonstrations and that activism should be nonviolent, but I feel that it should be persistent. And already, as a result of the activism we saw this summer, there are cities and states around the country that have passed laws prohibiting no-knock warrants because of what happened with Breonna Taylor, or prohibiting chokeholds because of George Floyd and Eric Garner and far too many more. Cities and mayors are challenging themselves to work with their local communities to see what is our social agreement about, community agreement about the use of force, because police are there to de-escalate. Our military, they're there to escalate, which is why I question anytime we start bringing our military in to deal with domestic unrest. So what are the skills that we are giving people so that they are equipped to go out into communities and serve and protect, and not create a situation where we have to fear them? So I clearly am a big supporter of activism, but activism alone is not enough to force change. We also have to vote. And I think we have to pair the two. And I think oftentimes young people feel, well, what difference does one vote make? Elections have consequences, and I'm not just talking about who's running for the president. If you say you don't like the way the police treat Black communities, well, who's your police chief? And who appoints that police chief? The mayor. Who confirms the police chief? The city council. Who are the prosecutors who are deciding whether or not they have such a cozy relationship with the police they don't want to upset the apple cart? And how are they using that prosecutorial discretion? Is it done in a discriminating way or in a fair way? With this COVID-19, we've had a pretty painful civics lesson about the health disparities that we're seeing, the accessibility to healthcare. I mean, ironically or painfully, at the same time as so many people are losing their insurance because they've lost their jobs under the COVID-19, we see that the Trump administration is in court trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act without a plan to replace it, and signing an executive order saying, well, we're going to protect people with pre-existing conditions is actually not worth the paper it's written on. If the court rules that the act is unconstitutional, then you've got to go back to Congress to enact a new law, but there is no plan for that new law. And in the meantime, in the middle of a COVID pandemic, people will not have health insurance. 20 million people rely on the exchanges for health insurance. So a long way of saying all the activism in the world isn't going to change the people who occupy those offices if you are unhappy with them. Voting is what makes change happen.
Thank you. And so we mentioned this a little bit before, but I kind of want to go back to this potentially worst case scenario. It come November 3rd, right? So both the president
Trying to raise my blood pressure.
perhaps, maybe a little bit. Uh,
All right, let's go to your doomsday scenario.
Doomsday scenario. So both the president and vice president have refused to, come out and accept the results of this upcoming election. They've kind of flirted with the idea of contesting the results come November 3rd. And our question is, first of all, what is the actual feasibility of this? Is this something that can actually happen? What can it do to our faith in our elections and in our entire system? We've already mentioned the potential delayed results, but what happens if the president just refuses to concede?
Well, he doesn't have to concede. Fortunately, it's not up to him. It's up to the secretaries of state that report their findings. It's up to the Electoral College. He does not have, this is not a dictatorship. Now he can say, I don't agree with the outcome. And then he can go to court to try to overrule the outcome. Another reason he's so anxious, in my opinion, to get a seat confirmed, Amy Coney Barrett confirmed on the Supreme Court, is he'd like to make sure that if this does end up in court, that his appointees are well represented on the court. But in the end, I actually think that the secretaries of state will confirm the outcomes. The Electoral College will do their job. And the only caveat to that was what I mentioned earlier, which is that if President Trump is so worked up about the outcome and won't go along with it, then it sends a powerful message to his supporters to respond to that. And I would just share with you, for a piece of history, that the last time we had one of these crises was in 2000 in Bush v. Gore. And obviously all roads led to Florida, and there was a contested period of time, ultimately went to the Supreme Court. But President Gore decided, for the smooth transition of power, it was important that he not continue to litigate the matter, that for the good of the country, he had to accept the ruling and not try to come up with another strategy to contest that election. I don't have the same confidence in President Trump. And so again, I think it's going to be up to his fellow members of his party, many of them who in their own heads probably think he's going too far. And in fact, right after the first time he started saying he wasn't sure about the smooth transition of power, you saw many of the Republican leaders in Congress saying, oh, no, this is the United States, and we will have a smooth transition of power. And so I am hopeful that even if he doesn't go along with the outcome, that the vast majority of leaders within his power do, and certainly the folks who are responsible for actually overseeing and concluding the outcome of the election will do so. But it could be a rocky few weeks in there, and I'm hoping that peaceful heads will prevail. And I'm also hoping, I always like to mention this because it surprises people, but I co-chaired President Obama's transition, and we disagreed with President Bush on maybe every single policy that he had, both domestic and foreign. And when President Obama was elected, President Bush called him up and said, I want you and Michelle to come to the White House. Laura and I'd love to host you and bring your team. And President Bush signaled to his team in the White House and in the cabinet that he expected complete support in order to have a smooth transition of power, even though we were from opposite parties. And I remember the first time I went to the White House to meet with my predecessor, I didn't expect him to be warm. He couldn't have been more decent. He gave me the full benefit of the experience that he'd had during those 8 years. And even though I may not have followed every piece of his advice, it was useful. And we tried to do the same thing for the Trump administration. So it isn't just a matter of the president saying, yes, I will agree and go along. You need to have that transition period so that you can hit the ground running. And in the midst of this COVID-19, it's particularly important, I think, to have a lot of cooperation from the team. And I worry that that might not happen either. But the good news there is if Vice President Biden is successful, he has at least had the second most important job for 8 years and can hit the ground running. But it would be a lot easier to do that with the support of the Trump administration. And I worry about that lack of support. But President Bush did it for us. We did it for Trump. And that is how it has always been. And we should pride ourselves in saying that when the campaign is over, you have to govern for the entire country. and do what's in that country's best interest, which means cooperate.
So I just wanted to briefly announce to the audience that we have one more prepared question. So if you guys
get the
want to ask
questions going
afterwards, to please raise your blue hands and participate. If not, you could put the questions on the chat. I already see there are a couple there that we can get to. And finally, if you want to ask anonymously, feel free to just privately chat it to me and I will ask for you. Okay, so with that in mind, when everybody ready for their own questions. So our last questions was, how can we as lawyers and engaged citizens, or in our case, future lawyers, hold our officials accountable after an election, after they've been voted in?
Well, yeah, so the election is just the beginning. And in a sense, the demonstrations we saw this summer were an effort to hold our elected officials accountable. I'll tell you, if you think about just the case of George Floyd, although I wasn't happy today with the judge throwing out one of the charges against the lead officer, but the reason why the case was taken away from the local DA by the state's attorney general, Keith Ellison, who used to be a member of Congress, so I know him pretty well, was because there was so much pressure on the local DA that the attorney general said, I'm taking over this case and I'm going to do it in an expeditious and fair way and with transparency. He was responding to the pressure. He would not have gotten involved in the case had there not been demonstrations all over the streets of Minneapolis and Minnesota. And so we see that those demonstrations affected the behavior of somebody who was currently in office. And I already mentioned the laws that have been changed at the local level as a result of that pressure. The reason why it's a 1-2 punch, though, is that hold the people who are in office accountable, but if they don't change their behavior, if they don't reflect your values and your priorities, guess what? You get to vote in their next election. And so put as much pressure as you can on them while they're in office. And then if they don't comply with what you think is necessary, vote them out of office.
All right. And with that, we'll open up the Q&A for everybody in the audience.
Ariel, while you're looking for the Q&A, let me just say one more thing on the demonstration, that your activism shouldn't just be limited to demonstrations. You should call up your elected representatives. You should show up at town hall meetings. I mean, the reason why the Affordable Care Act is still the law of the land today is because after President Trump was elected and the Republicans went back to their communities to say, we're going to repeal this law we know you can't stand, what happened? They got huge pushback. And in the end, John McCain was the final vote that voted against repealing of the Affordable Care Act. And so it isn't just activism in the streets. You got to show up and you have to meet with elected officials. You have to write them letters. You have to call their offices. You have to make your voice heard in a way that they cannot ignore you. And that takes a whole range of different strategies. You have to go to the press. You have to use the platform you have in social media to highlight it. I mean, look, think about George Floyd, a 17-year-old Black woman captured that 8 minutes and 46 seconds on video. That's what enraged the country so much. It's not like he was the first Black man to be killed by the police. It was the gruesome, callous nature of his death. And that happened because of a citizen who was an activist, who said, let me make sure that this goes on, that this is put up and that everybody can see this. And so I just want to elaborate on there are many different strategies of activism. Demonstrations are just one.
For sure, and I encourage everyone to think about how they can, best be engaged citizens and help protect our democracy. I will, I guess, just if nobody wants to ask their question themselves, go through the questions on the chat. But also feel more than free. I'm just going to go chronologically because I feel like that is the most equitable way to do this. So the first question we have is about groups, organizing to prevent voter suppression. So John asks, are you confident that there are groups active to prevent voter suppression as much as possible in every state?
In every state, not as much as possible, of course. We could always use more groups, and it's part of why I know during each campaign, and it's certainly happening now again, at least my insight into the Biden campaign is that they're looking for lawyers who will volunteer to participate in voter protection efforts. And you don't have to be a lawyer to do it, but certainly they are looking for people with the highest skill sets. The former White House counsel, Bob Bauer, he's a mouthful. Bob Bauer is his lead lawyer on this, one of the most brilliant election lawyers in the country. And he just did an interview this week with John Heilman. I encourage anybody who's feeling nervous about whether or not there are good lawyers out there to protect our election. Bob's take is that this election will be fair. We have enough resources to ensure that we have lawyers out there in all of our states. But could we use more? Could we use help? Absolutely. And in addition to the campaigns, a big piece of what the ACLU does, and I probably should say that as you're thinking about your activism, think about an organization such as the ACLU. After the Muslim travel ban that President Trump put in place, the ACLU was on the front line, and I'm very proud. I'm on the board of LIFT. They contributed $1 million to support the ACLU. So they may not have been out in the streets demonstrating themselves, but they supported an organization that was willing to do battle with the Trump administration over an outrageous law that they had adopted or a policy that they had adopted. So again, multiple forums in which we can get involved, but there could always be more people helping. And one thing that is not helpful is when President Trump encourages supporters to be poll watchers. There are ways that you can work on election day. And for example, I'm a part of a nonpartisan organization, When We All Vote, and we are trying to use our platform to encourage 250,000 people to offer to be poll watchers on not poll watchers, but work election day, because so many of the people who normally work on election day are elderly. And we don't want them putting themselves in harm's way, and they're not going to do it. So we need to beef up the number of people who are trained and authorized to go out there. We don't need a bunch of, random militias showing up at the polls intimidating voters. And if that does happen, I expect the ACLU to be right there.
Okay, our next two questions both involve the Electoral College, so I'll kind of combine them. That way you can address the topic in one go. So one question is more general about, what is your opinion on the Electoral College as our voting system? Is it a good step towards, making sure all votes count equally? Is it still a viable option? And the second question is going to maybe get your blood pressure up again, because it's a more doomsday scenario. And it asks, if the election ends up getting decided by a competing slate of electors and Congress chooses which ones to count on January 6th, what role should or would large-scale street demonstrations play?
Yeah, well, in this case, I think it's just going to end up in the courts as opposed to the legislature. So the demonstrations are probably not going to be as impactful because the people who will be deciding have lifetime appointments. So that's my guess there. As for the efficacy of the Electoral College as a method for determining the outcome of our elections, I think we need to take a fresh look at it. And broader, actually, than just the Electoral College, for that matter. I mean, if you think about it, why does Vermont have the same number of senators as New York State? I do believe that the change in demographics and geography of the American people has changed pretty dramatically since the Electoral College was put into place. And I do think that you need some checks and balances, but I'm not sure that it currently makes sense. It troubles me that a handful of states are determining the outcome of our election. I don't think that really reflects a democracy. And those swing states, as we call them, have just an inordinate amount of say in the outcome. And that doesn't feel right to me. But I think I'm not really equipped to say what the change should be. But I do think it's worth a fresh look. Why wouldn't we? I mean, look, and I know that I'm looking in the chat, this is another question which kind of follows in sequence, but we should look at how we appoint people to particularly the highest court, but all of the federal courts. And what Vice President Biden said yesterday is, look, I want to appoint a bipartisan commission. I think it's important that it be bipartisan to take a fresh look. Is 9 the right number? I happen to think 9 is a good number. But should it be a different number? Should they be lifetime appointments? Or should there be term limits? I don't know. But it worries me as we get an aging, an older and older bench that are making decisions that affect the lives of all of our Americans. I think it should be more representative. But I think the process is important. And I think people and transparency of process is important. And so why not take a fresh look at our electoral process and see what makes sense similarly, but hopefully with a different outcome than what happened several years ago when the Citizens United lawsuit was brought and determined that corporations are people too, which I think was absolutely the wrong decision. And not just because I support campaign finance and I think it's nefarious to have these large corporations writing checks and dark money where there is no transparency, but also from a legal perspective, if you want to hide behind the corporate veil and avoid personal liability, well, then I don't think that you should be able to act like a person and use your corporation to make contributions to campaigns. So anyway, I say let's take a fresh look at all of that and see what we think makes sense. And let's do it in a way that is not even bipartisan, nonpartisan.
I appreciate you taking over my job for me.
You're welcome. Well, I was reading too, sorry.
No, please. It's great. It was a natural segue. So the next question actually comes from my co-president of ACS, Vatsala. So voting rights seems like it should be a nonpartisan issue, but as we've seen, it clearly is not this election cycle. We should all want everyone to vote. Do you find that to be the case? If not, what do you think we can do to change that?
Well, look, of course it should be nonpartisan. It's an underpinning of the democracy. And so I think it's unfortunate that it's becoming partisan, but you name me something that isn't partisan today. Why is wearing a mask partisan? Why wouldn't you just do what scientists tell you to do? Why is social distancing partisan? I mean, I think we are at a very bad place. And I think that the only way that that changes, the only way that our country kind of comes together and heals is once again, if we the people say, that's enough, that we actually, as you learn in law school, certainly, we can take different sides of an issue and see all of them and respect a different side, even if you don't agree with it, and have conversations that are uncomfortable, but lead towards a better outcome. And I think that part of what's contributing to this polarized climate that we're in is your generation receives information, as we all do now, on demand. But your generation didn't have the experience that mine did of kind of the old school way of doing it, where we learned all along to take in things we disagreed with and to go through the rigor of hearing truth and knowing it's fact-based. Now you are the ones that decide what's accurate and what's not. And guess what? We're not in a position to do that. And so people who like one source of information coming from a political end of the spectrum to which they agree tend to only, let's just call it what it is. People who watch MSNBC don't watch Fox, and vice versa. And I worry that we're getting into these cocoons of echo chambers, and part of being a part of this big, complicated, diverse, incredible country is learning how to compromise, learning how to see different perspectives, learning how to engage and disagree without being disagreeable, in the hopes that maybe you'll learn something. And even if you don't change your mind, it will be a more rigorous analysis if it's challenged. And I am worried that not enough of that is happening. So enjoy that you can do it while you're in school, because when you get out, it's harder.
So our next question is probably something that a lot of people in the audience would like to hear you speak about, which is career advice.
Yes, that's what I do for a living.
So yeah, we would love to hear from you and learn how as law students we should be thinking about careers in public interest, how, what advice you would give, what we should be planning for.
Well, so do the exact opposite of what I did when I was your age, which was that, I went to law school because my best friend was 2 years older than I, and I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. I took the GREs. I thought about going into clinical psychology because I'd majored in psych. I took the LSATs. I was going to take the GREs, but there was a really good party the night before the GREs, so I never made it to the GREs. In retrospect, I wish I'd gotten a joint degree in law and in business, because I had to kind of learn business on the fly. And then when I got to law school, as I'm sure you all know, that the big law firms come to campus and they fly you back and you get room service. And I could order a shrimp cocktail that my parents never let me order growing up as a kid. And I just kind of followed the path of least resistance. And I woke up 6 years later where everybody thought I had this dream job. I made $30,000 a year. That was more money in 1981 than I had any idea what to do with. I couldn't possibly spend $30,000 a year. And I was the first lawyer in my family. My parents were really proud of me. And I was miserable. And then I had a baby. And if I wasn't miserable before I had my daughter, boy, was I miserable after. And I would leave her every morning to go to a job that was unfulfilling. And I would say to myself, what am I doing? And I also would say to myself, will she ever be proud of me if I keep doing this? And so I had to listen to what's the most important voice, and that's the quiet one inside of me. And I wrote a whole book about this, which I would encourage you all to read because it's really meant for your age cohort. And as I tried to figure out what to do next, a good friend said to me, well, why don't you consider public service? And I had considered going to Washington, but I spent my second summer in law school at a law firm in DC. And I thought, oh, all they talk about is one thing in this town. I don't want to go to Washington. It's a company town. So my friend had worked for Mayor Harold Washington, the first Black mayor of Chicago. And Washington had just been reelected to his second term. And my friend was going back to his law firm. He'd taken a 2-year leave to go in. And he said, why don't you go? You'll feel so much a part of something bigger and more important than yourself. And there was something about that just resonated with me. And so I took a leap of faith and I joined government at the local level. Now that was not on my 10-year plan when I finished college, quite to the contrary, which means be flexible and be willing to pivot and shift, but mostly listen to yourself. And I will say, having now spent half of my life in the private sector and half in the public, I'm glad that I did both. That's point number one. Point number two is I'm really glad I started at the local level. Now, maybe that's not as sexy as working in the White House, but it is in the local level of government that I learned what public service is all about. And I mean, look, you're in Chicago. If your snow's not picked up, if your garbage isn't picked up, if you call 911 and nobody comes, I mean, all of these are the basic city services that are delivered to you by your government. I didn't even know who my alderman was when I started working in City Hall. I had no idea how the city worked. I also learned how to listen. And at the local level, it is 24/7. I mean, I could not go to the 53rd Street Shopping Center without somebody coming up to me saying, I want you to do this, or I would take my daughter to the park. And in fact, somebody tried to lobby my daughter and gave her a note to give to me when she was 6. Now, I thought that was going a little bit too far. I had demonstrations at my office. I had demonstrations in front of my home. I had demonstrations at board meetings, one of which we had to bring in the SWAT team, which was, they were more unnerving, frankly, than the people who were demonstrating. But all of that is as it should be. To our earlier part of the conversation, I learned how to take that pressure. I learned how to go to a meeting and have people, and look, keep in mind, I went there because I wanted to be a part of something bigger than myself. And so I would show up at a community meeting and I go, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. Well, guess what? Nobody believed me. Nobody trusted me. Everybody yelled at me. And what did I do? I kept going back and back and get back. And some of my dearest friends today are people who used to yell at me at those meetings because I worked to earn their trust. And I think that those lessons that you can learn in local government served me so well in Washington because your constituents are proximate. You can't get away from them. It is 24/7. And if you don't like that, then you probably shouldn't be in public service. If you are in an outward facing position, there are lots of positions in government where you don't have to interface with the public, but it is that piece of it that I found most satisfying, is to take a problem and say, I am going to make the government work for you rather than you having to work so hard to get what you need out of government. So the career advice is, it doesn't matter where you start, keep an open mind, look for opportunities that never knock at opportune moments, but they do knock. And don't be so wedded to what you think today is going to be your career plan, because trust me, you wouldn't be in the least bit interested of anything I have to say if I had stayed on my initial trajectory.
Thank you. And I really appreciate your talk about public and local politics, especially because local politics are so important and so often overlooked by so many people. And our next question kind of gets towards the same issue, which is more about community engagement in Chicago. So the question asks, are there any civic engagement causes beyond just robust voting or innovative grassroots groups, particularly in Chicago, you think young law students, such as ourselves, should be aware of and should consider getting involved with?
Yes, so I think the Obama Foundation is one. Full disclosure, I'm a senior advisor to them as well. They obviously have a relationship with the university, and it is intended to be a platform to train the next generation of leaders, such as yourselves, of the nuts and bolts of how to have evidence-based strategies that actually improve our communities and take those strategies to scale, both in Chicago, in the United States, and around the world. And so I would commend you all to, you can go online and look at the center and see the kinds of things that they're doing, but it also is a gateway, will list for you organizations in Chicago that are doing work that you might be interested in. And so they've been accumulating a data bank. And rather than me saying, do this or do that, I just suggest you do your homework, look through the list, and then go and, lift up the hood and kick the tires of organizations and see if you think that leadership is actually doing good and important work. I will say this, and when I first started doing, I'm trying to think of exactly when this would have come. I guess most prominently when I was Commissioner of Planning and Development in the early 90s for Chicago. And I did a lot of work redeveloping Woodlawn to the south and North Kenwood to the north of the University of Chicago, and worked with a whole host of different organizations in that effort. And I would run into University of Chicago students who were volunteering with at some of those organizations. And I was struck at the time that the university students were not always working at organizations that had really quality services that they were delivering. And there wasn't anybody to help them organize how they volunteered. And Michelle Obama, her first job at the University of Chicago was organizing volunteers to help say, well, here's a data bank of organizations that are actually practicing evidence-based strategies, as opposed to those that just show up and demonstrate and don't actually do anything beyond just that. So that was very useful. So I encourage you, a long way of saying, of one place to go is the UC, and another place is the foundation, and try them out. They would be hungry for some talent to help, and do it for free because you will get a better experience if they don't have to worry about how to pay you right off the bat. But there are also internships available at a bunch of different organizations as well. And I like the idea, again, of starting local, because you'll see the change. That was the other thing that I loved about local public service, is that you got to meet the people whose lives you were changing. And relationships are the elixir of life. And that's much harder to do when you are removed. And I also just think that when people go to Washington, it's easy. The numbers are so big and the policies are so wonky that it's easier to forget who you're there to serve. And so I like the fact that when I worked in the White House, my responsibilities included overseeing offices such as the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. Those were all the state and local elected officials outside of Congress, and the Office of Public Engagement, which was the outward-facing office through which the American people could interface with the White House. And it was because the president wanted his decisions to be informed by the people on the ground. And oftentimes that doesn't happen in Washington. And it was really one of the reasons why I was thrilled to go, is to bring that reservoir of practical feedback from stakeholders whose lives would be affected by our decisions. So yeah, but I'm glad I did both. I had a chance to try both federal and local.
So I have a question about the other side of local politics, which is how do we get voters to pay attention to local politics? How do we get people excited about whether or not a judge is retained in in Cook County, or who their local alderman is.
Yeah, it's retail politics. I have not found a better substitute for people who you trust, encouraging you to do something differently. And look, I worked on 2 presidential campaigns that were based in grassroots organizing. And part of the reason, well, one of the many reasons I think President Obama won not just once, but twice, is because we invested in field organizers all across the country who, when I would show up in a part of the country to campaign, I worked for the field organizer. They told me where to go. They introduced me to people. It was their imprimatur that really opened the door for me to come in and advocate for the president. And that's how relationships work. You believe people you trust. And so I think we get people involved in local politics, number one, when they respect the person who's the mayor. That's what led me into politics. Mayor Washington was just a charismatic, delicious person. And he was recruiting lawyers to come and change the law department because he wanted to professionalize it. He wanted the quality of services that the citizens of Chicago received from their lawyers to be the same as big corporations were receiving. And so it was cool to go in. I mean, there was a certain gravitas to going and working for both Mayor Washington and I would say Mayor Daley had the same kind of draw when he was first elected. The Corporation Council had been a hotshot lawyer at Mayor Brown, and he left that to go be the Corporation Counsel for the city of Chicago. His successor had been the Associate General Counsel at the University of Chicago Law Department, and then went on to become the Corporation Counsel. And now she's leading the university's effort on the library, Susan Schur. So I think a lot of it turns on the charisma of the person who's luring you in. And I think that that should apply to any job you take. Don't affiliate yourself with any institution where you don't respect the person at the top. But I also think that if my friend hadn't said to me, hey, it's really cool to go work at the law department, I would never have considered it.
So I think we probably have time for about one more audience question.
Okay.
Because we're getting, maybe more, we'll see. I just wanted to
I'll try to go faster.
Our time limit. So one of our audience members is asking about the move to make Washington, D.C. a state. I'm going to add in here Puerto Rico as well, because I think both are kind of coming up in a little bit of equivalent circumstances. So I guess the question is, do you think this would make our political system more equitable? I know you referenced a little bit earlier that you think maybe we should be rethinking the entire Senate structure as a whole. So I would love to hear your thoughts on these issues.
Well, so I think DC should be a state. The people of DC overwhelmingly want it to be a state. And right now they're taxed without representation. And that's, I think, not as it should be. Puerto Rico is a little bit different because there is a division among the people who live in Puerto Rico. And we stepped our toe into this matter when I was in the White House because of my intergovernmental affair hat that I was wearing. And what it became clear to us is that the people of Puerto Rico hadn't reached a consensus. If they reach a consensus and want to be a state, I'd be all for it. But I do think it's up to the people of the state of Puerto Rico to decide their own fate and whether they want to be a state or not. But I would certainly support it. It's a huge population. It's a part of the United States. I think it is certainly should be eligible for statehood if that's what they want.
So, sure. I'm gonna give a second for any audience questions, and if not, I can go back to some of the other ones that we have prepared. All right, okay then. So, I guess one of the questions is, you know, there's a very short time till the election starts. And there are so many issues currently surrounding both like the implementation of the election, all these different, possible nightmare situations. And I guess a question is, what are some like very, very basic and very, very practical steps we should be taking today? Do you think we should be voting early or do you think we should?
Yes, vote today, right now. Like, hang up on me. I'll be okay with that and go vote. Look, let's be realistic. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. It is unsafe to be close to people. I think we could all hopefully agree on that. And so why wouldn't you try to figure out a way to vote as safely as possible and avoid the lines the best you can? And I've been a big supporter of early vote long before the global pandemic. And I say this particularly to students your age because things come up. You all oversleep all the time. Come on now, you know that. Or you have a busy schedule that day, or you have an exam that you haven't quite prepared for sufficiently. Why would you put something off to the last minute when you're given the opportunity to plan to do it sooner? This is not something to procrastinate for, because you don't want to wake up the day after the election and say, darn it, I missed that, and now I'm not happy with the outcome. Well, you know what? You don't get to complain, in my mind, if you don't vote. And so I would say make a plan, and you decide what your plan should be. It's getting a little late for the absentee ballots. I'm not sure that I would do that at this stage. I think Illinois has drop boxes, so maybe what you do is get the ballot in the mail and then go drop it off, so you don't have to have, you know, 2 different postal trips. But yeah, go vote, like right now. Hang up, go.
I think that's a really good note to end on. Thank you so much, Valerie, for taking the time. Everyone who's in this call, go vote. You heard it from Ms. Jarrett. And we really it was so wonderful to learn from you and to gain some insight into the issues that you think are important.
Well, I enjoyed chatting with you as well. Thank you, Ariel, too.
Thank you so much.
All right, have a good day, everybody. And remember where you're going next. Vote. Bye.